Okay, if you remember from last time, I introduced you to the three basic types of metamorphosis: ametabolous, hemi or parometabolous, and holometabolous. Now we're going to take some time to look at each cycle individually. So let's start with ametabolous. Remember, that word ametabolous means no metamorphosis. It's characterized by no real developmental change. So these insects are collectively known as the ametabola, and their members are said to be ametabolous. Okay, so all the insects start out as eggs in ametabola. During ametabolous development, there is no substantial developmental change in appearance from the young to the adult. So in this case, the adults look exactly like the young. Okay, so the young look like just miniature versions of the mature adults. The only thing different is the size. Now, the young of the ametabola are called nymphs. So you'll see all over the internet in various places they call them larvae. That's not true. So they are called a nymph. Okay, so therefore their life cycle goes from egg through nymph and into the adults. And an insect that develops in this manner is, for example, the silverfish. You can see a silverfish here, and the young look exactly like the adults, except they're tiny. Yeah, so there's no substantial change. So they can have a variety of different life stages or instars, but they go egg, several nymphal instars, and eventually they're the mature adults. What makes them an adult is they have mature sexual organs. The end. Now, Paro means slight. In parometabolous development, there's only a slight change between each developmental stage. In this developmental type, insects are laid down as eggs. They're oviposited. They hatch into the young nymphs, and then they develop a little. They turn into older nymphs, the next instar, develop a little bit more, turn into older nymphs, and then eventually become adults. So they pass through an egg, a nymph, older nymph, and adult stages. The number of nymphal stages or nymphal instars depends on the species, as with everything, and their major difference between the young and the adults is usually the presence of wings. So we see something like these really young nymphs here. You can see that they have very tiny wing buds. The wings get a little bit bigger, and then when they become adults, they turn into fully formed wings. So that is usually what we see as the major difference there. So the thing that characterizes parometabolous insects is that the nymph and the adult stages live in the same habitat. So examples of parometabolous insects are things like true bugs or cockroaches or lice or termites. So they don't have a significant change, but they live in the same area.
The mantis has 3 life stages: egg, nymph, and adult. This process is called incomplete metamorphosis because there is no pupal stage during development to an adult. The nymphs resemble the adult. After mating, female mantids, like this Chinese mantis, produce egg cases. An egg case can be about 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter. There can be up to 400 mantis eggs in a single egg case. The female mantis attaches the egg case to branches, where it overwinters until spring arrives. The nymphs hatch from the eggs as the weather gets warmer. They exit the egg case through an opening. Many of the nymphs do not survive more than a few hours. Since a mantis's body continues to grow, but its exoskeleton does not, the insect must go through a molt, where it sheds its old exoskeleton. A soft new exoskeleton forms under the old one and hardens after the mantis finishes its molt. A mantis nymph can molt up to 10 times. The mantis grows with each molt. After the last time the mantis molts its exoskeleton, it will have its full-grown wings like this Chinese mantis.
Another type of gradual metamorphosis is called hemimetabolous metamorphosis. So hemi means half, and in hemimetabolous development, the young look a lot like the adults with two major differences. In particular, the young do not have wings, while the adults do. That may sound a lot like parametabolous, and in some ways you're right. The distinction between hemimetabolous and parametabolous is that the young do not live in the same habitat as the adults. So parametabolous, they all live in the same habitat. Oftentimes they are terrestrial. In hemimetabolous, on the other hand, the young are aquatic. And so they have their second major difference, which is they have gills instead of the straight up spherical openings that the adults have. So the young, in this case, are called naiads. So you see a lot of people calling the young nymphs. They're called naiads when we are specific. So you will find that this differentiation does not get taught the same all over entomology classes. And this has to do with one of those things change in biology, and biology is messy type of things that I keep talking about. And you will find that it is mostly aquatic entomologists that like making this distinction. So it is most important to aquatic entomologists to specify those insects that have an aquatic stage versus those that don't. So other entomologists may not make this distinction. So they tend to lump all insects that go through gradual metamorphosis under this hemimetabolous group. So you will see this distinction mostly in aquatic species. Now, the reason that I teach it to you is because sometimes we do deal with bodies that are in aquatic regions, but mostly it's because it's easier to learn this distinction at the beginning than try to memorize it later on. So I want you to know that there are two ways of knowing it, parametabolous and hemimetabolous. For the purposes of this class, I want you to make that distinction. So terrestrial insects are found on land. If they have a gradual metamorphosis, they're called parametabolous, and that gives you the idea that the nymphs and the adults are going to be competing with each other. They're living in the same habitat, they're feeding on the same food, and they're in competition. The hemimetabolous metamorphosis insects, though, they don't have competition within their life cycle. So the young, the naiads, live underwater. They feed on whatever it is they feed on in water. So some will feed on waterborne plants, some are predators, whatever it is, while the adults live terrestrially. A lot of times we see them as flying insects, so they're flying around on land, they're doing that sort of thing. So it goes egg, naiad, so various naiad stages or naiad instars. They then eclose into the adult stage that lives on land. So examples of this are things like mayflies and dragonflies, damselflies, stoneflies. So we'll look at those quite a bit. All right, the last developmental cycle is holometabolous development. So holo means entire, complete, or whole. So it has a complete change. So the change between the young and the adult stages are significant. So in this case, the young are termed larvae, and they look very, very different from that final adult stage. The insects will start out as eggs, and they'll pass through the egg, larvae, and then they have an extra stage called the pupal stage. So the larvae tend to live in the same basic habitat as the adults, but because they are significantly different in body form, they tend to eat different food. So we don't see a lot of competition between the larvae and the adults like we do in parametabolous insects. Okay, so the larvae will go through a variety of instars, or a certain number of instars depending on species, and that can change anywhere from just a few, like 2 or 3, to many, many, many. We're talking 40 or 50, depending on the species. Now, the larval stage is generally the main feeding stage. So you'll see the larvae of different sizes feeding as much as physically possible. I mean, they're basically just guts and mouth parts, and that's all they do. And that's, if you think about caterpillars, that makes a lot of sense, right? They're sitting on plants, they're just eating plants like mad, feeding on those leaves, and then they're trying to build up that fat body, build up their energy stores so they can make it through this pupal stage and have a massive change, okay? A massive metamorphosis into that adult stage. Now, once they are done with the larval stage, the holometabolous insect will pupate. They do this in a variety of ways. In forensically important insects, we see them changing the outer layer of their integument into a hardened pupal casing. Other insects will shed that exoskeleton, leave the exuvia in the environment, and instead of shedding into a new larval stage, they'll shed into the pupal stage. Still others may spin an extra casing around that pupal casing called the cocoon, and that's extra protection. So you may have heard about or seen a cocoon in a certain moth, say. Now, some insects have what we term a chrysalis. So you may have heard the term chrysalis, right? We see this a lot in grade school because this chrysalis is specific for the pupae of butterflies or certain butterflies. So they have a specific type of pupal stage called the chrysalis. Okay. Now, the pupal stage is usually immobile, although some species may be capable of limited movement. They may be able to swim, they may be able to wiggle around a little bit, but the entire job of this pupal casing is to break down the adult body, or the larval body, and turn it into the adult body. So the larval organs, the larval appendages, everything are broken down. They are digested internally and replaced with new adult structures that grow from areas of undifferentiated or embryonic tissue in the larvae called imagonal discs. So you can think of them as basically little areas of stem cells almost. So these undifferentiated tissue that are just waiting, and they're mapping out the places where things like the adult mouth parts, the genitalia, the wings are going to be. So we can see in the larvae where the adult forms are going to be. That's all laid down in the embryo. Okay. And so when this pupal stage happens, those undifferentiated cells just get their day in the sun and they start to grow. They start to differentiate and turn into the wings and the mouth parts, all that sort of stuff. So then the insects will stay in this pupal stage for as long as they need to, and then the insects will emerge or eclose from that pupal stage by splitting the pupal case along a weakened margin in that case. So the location of this weakness naturally depends on the species, but it tends to be either anteriorly or dorsally, somewhere along that thoracic or head region where it's really, really strong and they're able to pop that case open. Now, once the insect ecloses from the pupae, it is now in the adult stage, and it looks substantially different from the larval stage. Okay, now this is a movie of the Life of the Painted Lady. This is something by a filmmaker. Pretty awesome stuff. So this is what the caterpillar or the larva looks like very, very young. This is the first instar larvae. Then they molt into this second instar a couple weeks later, and all they do is they feed. So they have those mandibulate mouth parts and they just feed. So like I said, they are guts with mouth parts, right? And they're just eating and eating and eating. Then they go into their pupal stage called the chrysalis here. Okay, so this takes, like it says, 68 minutes. But they shed that last layer of exoskeleton of the larvae, and then they turn into the chrysalis. Now, here they are eclosing from that chrysalis stage. Okay, so notice that they have that area of weakness on the thoracic region. They pull themselves out. And look at those wings. They're all like nice and crunched down. It takes them a while to sclerotize. And then they get to this adult stage. They have significantly different mouth parts. Do you remember what they are? Siphoning. All right, so that was the life cycle of the butterfly, Holometabolus. Now, I'm going to take this time to go through the ticks a little bit. Remember that ticks aren't insects. They're acari. They are in arachnids, right? So they have a life cycle that mimics some of the insects, though with just a few changes. Most ticks go through 4 life stages. They start as the egg, they go through the 6-legged larval stage, the 8-legged nymphal stage, and then the adult stage. So remember that all adult arachnids have 8 legs, but these larvae of the ticks have a 6-legged stage, that really young larval stage. So after hatching from the eggs, the ticks must eat blood at every stage to survive. So they need a warm-blooded host. Ticks that require many hosts can take up to 3 years to complete their full life cycle, and a lot will die because they don't find a host for their next feeding. But depending on the type of tick, the females will lay their eggs either on the ground or in a potential host nest, somewhere like that. The larvae are going to hatch out of that egg, and they're very, very tiny. They're going to find a host. Then they're going to either molt on or off host. And then some ticks spend their entire life on a single host. Some go between hosts, from between molt to molt. But the idea is they will feed, they will molt, they will get a little bit bigger, so they'll grow into a nymphal stage. They either have one or many nymphal instars, then they will molt into the adult stage. So it's basically, we have those 2 major names, the larvae and the nymph, when it comes to the tick. So it goes egg, larvae, nymph, and adult. All right, that's it for this lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.